Hello everyone, this is a lecture on liquid verbs. Liquid verbs are Greek verbs whose verb stem ends in the consonants lambda, mu, nu, or rho. So these verbs, liquid verbs, have nothing to do with liquids, that is, verbs of pouring or verbs of drinking, or verbs that deal with anything to do with pouring out a liquid. These are verbs whose verb stem ends in a lambda, a mu, a nu, or a rho. So if that's the case, if they end in these letters, why is that a problem? Well, they're not a problem when you're dealing with the present or imperfect, but when you move to the future and the first aorist, some problems emerge because the sigma of the tense formatives collides with these liquid verb consonants, and that creates a problem. Oftentimes the sigma drops out when it follows a liquid consonant, but it's a little more complicated than that, so that's why we need to have a full chapter in the book and a full lecture on this. Think of liquid verbs in this way as a memory device. Think of the word mineral, which has all the letters here: the mu, the nu, the rho, and the lambda. And when you open a bottle of mineral water or carbonated water, you hear a s sound. There's a s sound, a hissing sound, and that's the sigma. And it's trying to get away from these liquid consonants. So think of it that way. So let's deal with the future first, okay, of liquid verbs. So the future active and the future middle of liquid verbs are noticeably different from the typical forms of the future. Typical forms of the future, you see a sigma, right? You have the verb stem and you have the personal endings, and in between you have the sigma. And the most evidence, again, is the absence of the sigma here. The presence of the liquid consonants causes the sigma to drop off. But more stuff happens than just the sigma dropping off. It's a little more complicated than that. Okay? As I said on this slide, it's a little more complicated than that simple explanation. The true tense formative for the future of liquid verbs is epsilon sigma. Okay, epsilon sigma. So this intervocalic sigma, so you have the verb stem, you have the tense formative, and then you have the connecting vowel, which is a epsilon or an omicron, and then you have the personal endings. Well, what happens here? Kind of the similar thing that we saw way back with contract vowels. This epsilon and the connecting vowels collide and they contract. That's what happens. The epsilon contracts with the connecting vowels. So here's an example. It says the verb meno, which means I remain or I abide. So you get men plus the tense formative plus the first person plural ending, and you get this, but the sigma drops off and you get the epsilon omicron, which contracts to omicron upsilon, and you notice that circumflex accent. That's very important to note because that is the marker, one of the key clues that you're dealing with a liquid verb in the future. You're going to see that circumflex accent over everywhere where you see vowel contraction. So here is the future active of meno, which is I remain. So meno, menes, mene, men umen, men eta, men usen. Now, what do you note here? These look very much like, in form, to the present. The only difference here is we see in the first plural and the second plural vowel contraction. Everywhere else it behaves quite naturally, and that's because it's a combo of an epsilon and a connecting vowel, either an epsilon or an omicron. And it only becomes a problem here in these two where we see a marked difference. But again, note these circumflex accents all over the place. So, other than the vowel contraction in the second, the visible vowel contraction in the first and second plural forms, and the change of form, this is the only hint to you to mark the difference between the present and the future of this particular liquid verb. So you got to note that. You've got to pay attention to this little detail. And this is kind of, again, reiterating what I just said on the previous slide. The presence of the circumflex accent is what is going to be your clue, and the first and second plurals do have minor differences because of the vowel contraction. So that's important to note. Further, some other things to note about the future of liquid verbs. And some liquid futures have minor stem changes. So we learned the lexical or the present tense form. What we see with some of these liquid verbs is that the present form or the lexical form is quite different from the future form. So what happened here? This iota dropped. What happened? Iro with aro, egero with egero, the iota dropped out. And here, apostello versus apostello, the lambda dropped off. So you see letters drop off. That's what's happening here. Now let's deal with liquid aorists. So the aorist active and middle forms are a bit different because of, again, the tense formative sigma alpha. The sigma drops off, but the alpha remains. Okay? And furthermore, so that's the big thing that happens. Furthermore, some verb stems undergo minor changes to compensate for the loss of the sigma. So for instance, meno in the first aorist form is mena. Okay, notice the lengthening here. The epsilon lengthens to an epsilon iota. Apostela, okay, apostela, you get two things happening here with apostello to its first aorist form. Well, again, noting it's a compound verb, so the augment occurs right there. Again, you have a lengthening of the epsilon here to an epsilon iota, and you get the double lambda becoming a single lambda. So those are the things that happen there. And again, iro, like it did in the future, the iota drops. And again, you get the lengthening of that alpha to show the augment. So those are some things to note with liquid aorists. And here's an example. Here's the paradigm. So again, same endings. Okay, so just the alpha here, zero ending. Sigma switches to an epsilon, just like it did with first aorists, our other first aorist. Men, te, and the new here. Okay, so this is just like what we learned when we learned alusa. Alusa, alusas, alusen, alusamen, alusata, alusan. What we're seeing here is the sigma's gone and the lengthening of this middle, this stem vowel, okay, from the epsilon meno to the epsilon iota that we see in the first aorist. But other than that, it looks almost like exactly like what we see in the first aorist. So things to note with these liquid aorists: there's no sigma; it's gone. The augment and the first aorist endings are still used. First aorist endings are, zero, sigma, epsilon and movable nu. Men, te, and nu. Okay, these endings are still the same as we saw with the first aorist paradigm that we first learned. Still the same, but the only difference is there's no sigma. And there are minor changes to the verb stem. So here is a summary chart of some liquid verbs, and this is in the handout. It's also in the book. A form of this is in the book. So what we're seeing here is, again, your present or lexical form, the form that you learned, and we're seeing the future form and the aorist form, noting things like, okay, the changes in the stem. Okay, iro, the iota drops here. Noting also with, again, the loss of lambda with these double lambda verbs. And again, ap and gelo, the epsilon lengthens to an epsilon iota. So there's lengthening and the drop of the lambda here. Apokrinomai, there's no future form. And again, it is a middle-only verb, so no sigma and amen. No changes to the stem, so that's pretty good. Pokteno, this is I kill. In the future form, the dropping of the iota, and again, the typical circumflex accent over the omega. And over here in the first aorist form, we see the augment occur. It's a compound verb, and no other it changes. It stays. Its stem vowel stays basically the same. Apostello, again, we saw that earlier. The loss of the lambda in the future and in the first aorist, and the lengthening of that stem vowel. Hegero, we see the loss of the iota here, and again, no significant changes in the first aorist. Crino, again, no significant changes, again, noting the future form with this circumflex accent. Meno is our kind of paradigm verb, and we've already gone through that, noting the lengthening of that stem vowel. And sparrow, I sow. So again, the loss of the iota here for the future form, and no significant changes for the first aorist form. So that's your. Those are the typical liquid verbs that we find in the Greek New Testament, and that's just a summary. There are others, and again, just be aware of these things, that the future forms may be different than the lexical form, and the aorist form may have a different stem. But in both cases, there's loss of the sigma tense formative, and that's important. Here are some examples. Meneta en te agape mu. Jesus says in John 15:10 to his disciples, you will remain in my love. And again, how the key here is we see the circumflex, and we also see the vowel contraction that happened. Kai par auto e menan ten hemeran akanein. So this is John 2. The two disciples of John that follow Jesus when John points out that this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. They start following him. They hang out with Jesus, and this text says they remained with him that day. So there's your verb, emenan. So this is meno in the first aorist form, third plural form. And finally, tote Iesus apostelen duo mathetas. This is the right before the triumphant entry, and so Jesus and his disciples get to near Jerusalem, and Jesus sent, he sent sent two disciples into the village to get the donkey. So this is apostello, again noting compound verb, that's where the augment goes, lengthening of that vowel in the verb stem, and the loss of the lambda. So those are your liquid verbs. Again, refer to the handout, and we'll see you in class for more.